It's June 9, 2022. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm here at the Great Harbor Marina on the way down to my 1972 Allied Princess 36 Sequester. I think I'm probably not going to take the boat out today for a couple of reasons. First off, it's raining, and I'm not a big fan of sailing in the rain. And second, as you can see, as we look east out of Southwest Harbor, visibility leaves something to be desired. There's a little bit of fog out there. So, fog and rain, that means I'm going to stay in the marina today. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I think that what I'm going to do today while we're aboard Sequester is talk a little bit about buying an old fiberglass sailboat, and we're going to look at a particularly important system that you need to be aware of the details of, and that is the marine head. So let's get down onto the boat and settle in out of the rain and have a little conversation about marine heads. I made it aboard the boat. It's 52 degrees out there today with an east wind, so it's not very warm. And when you add the relatively heavy rain and the limited visibility, it is not a day to take the boat out unless you're one of those unusual people who likes sailing in the rain with less than 100-yard visibility. I am not that kind of person. Well, at least not anymore. I used to be. So anyway, now that I'm aboard the boat, it is a balmy 57 in here. So the first thing I did when I came aboard was to fire up the Dickinson propane fireplace. It's going to take a while to have much effect on the temperature in here, but the psychological effect is pretty positive. So we are going to warm the boat up a little for this chat. So as I said, what I'm going to talk about today is marine heads. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. This is Sequester's head. This is an old 50-year-old fiberglass sailboat, and that is a 50-year-old Wilcox Crittenden Junior 2 head. Now it still works fine, because except for the porcelain bowl and the wooden seat, the entire mechanism of the head is made out of bronze. So that's something you want to look for when you're looking at a marine head. Does it work? Is it a quality unit? The new heads are pretty much all plastic. They may have a porcelain bowl, but the mechanism is plastic, and they tend not to work that well after a few years. Now, although many modern heads and old ones like this are rebuildable, you may have some issues getting parts, and you may have the rather unpleasant task of taking the head apart and rebuilding it, because no matter what you do to a marine head, it's still a toilet, and when you take it apart, it's never going to be as clean as it was when it was new. So anyway, let's look at some of the other components of a marine head. Right behind this door is one of the important components. This is what is called a marine sanitation device, or in less technical terms, a holding tank. And here aboard Sequester, the output from the head is pumped directly into the holding tank. It goes in here and drains into the holding tank, and you cannot pump anything over the side directly on this boat. Over here is the outlet, and that hose is on the top of the tank. You might wonder, how does anything get out of the tank if the outlet is on the top? Well, there's a pickup tube that goes down to within about ½ an inch of the bottom of the tank, and suction is used to pump out, either via from there over to the Y valve via a deck pump out, which is on one side of the Y valve, or going out to this whale hand pump here, which is connected to a seacock. So you can pump over the side that way if you are more than 3 miles offshore. Now here in Southwest Harbor, we are in a no discharge zone, which means that you can never pump this head over the side when you're in here, for 2 reasons. One, it's a no discharge zone, so you cannot put waste over the side for any reason, and we're less than 3 miles from shore. In fact, we're about 150 feet from shore here. Heads like this need water to flush them. Many boats have the input hose for the head going to a seacock, and they take water from outside the boat, which in the case of Sequester here on the Gulf of Maine is salt water. Now I have changed that a little bit, and my inlet hose is plumbed to the drain for this sink. So if I want, I can open the seacock from the drain and pump water from outside the boat, or I can pour some water into the sink or run some water into the sink and flush the head with fresh water. We found over the years that a freshwater flush is a lot better at controlling odors. And it has another advantage. You can control how much water you're using to flush the head, which is important because a holding tank has a finite volume, and if you are profligate in how much water you use to flush, you will fill the holding tank up more quickly than if you're a little careful about it. And if you're close into shore, within 3 miles, you have only one option for getting your holding tank emptied, and that is to find a pump out station and pump the contents out into an on-land sewer system. So that may not be that easy in some places. Anyway, let's just sit down now and talk about marine heads in a little more detail. Okay, let's talk marine heads. We've seen what the major components are. I'll go over them again. The head, the marine sanitation device or holding tank, and the hoses, and then we have some way of getting waste out of the holding tank, either through a deck pump out, or if you're far enough offshore, an overboard discharge. And many boats have a Y valve in the pump out setup so that they can choose which way to go. And finally, how to get water into the head to flush the head. So I'm going to go through the various types of heads and what you should look for, and then we will be done with this video. I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly. So we'll start with the head. There are several types of heads. By far in a lot of sailboats, the most common is a standard manual head, like you saw in Sequester's head, where basically you have a hand pump on the head that you pump to flush the head. And that usually has a valve that you can change. So one is what's called dry pump, where you just pump stuff out of the head, and the other one is wet, where it pulls water in from whatever your water source is and uses that water to flush what's in the head out and rinse the head out. There are also heads called vacuum flush heads. I'm not sure if they're even still available, which have a hand pump mounted usually on the wall or bulkhead next to the head, and they have a seal on the seat. So you close the seat and you pump the hand pump, and it creates a partial vacuum which sucks the contents of the head out into the holding tank. And those are said to work very well. I personally have never used one, but I know people that have them that quite like them. The seals can be an issue though, and you have to watch that the seals are in good shape if you're buying a boat with one of those. And if the seals around the seat fail, then the vacuum flush won't work. Okay, the next kind of head that you're going to find is an electric head. And what electric heads are basically is, instead of a hand pump, they have an electric pump. That's usually what's called a macerator pump, which both pumps the contents of the head out and also chops it up into smaller bits that go into the tank, into the holding tank. And macerator heads or electric heads are great. They're easy to use. They usually are going to be set up so that when you push the button to flush, it will both draw water. It will open a valve so you can draw water into the head from whatever source you're getting it from, and run the macerator pump to pump the contents of the head out into your holding tank. Now, the only issue with those is that for the vast majority of them, if the pump fails or something in the electrical system fails or your batteries go flat, you can't flush. And that is never a good situation to be in. And frankly, if I had an electric head, I would probably carry a spare pump for it. And macerator pumps cost a couple of $100, maybe $300, depending on exactly what you need. And it'd be kind of a pain if you have your macerator pump fail when the head is occupied, and you have to then change out the pump when rather unpleasant contents are in there. And that could be an unpleasant, to say the least, job. But I guess it's better than not being able to flush at all. And another kind of head that's coming into popularity now is what's called a composting head. And they do not have a holding tank or any kind of overboard discharge. A better name for a composting head is a desiccating head. And basically what they do is they have a medium, usually what's called cocoa coir, which is the fuzz off coconut husks, or something like that, that you put into the chamber of a composting head. And then when you use the head for solids, they go in there and you have a little handle you crank and it mixes it up. And the composting head has a fan that draws air into the head and exhausts it out of the boat. And as that air goes through, it dries out the waste in the head. And once that material is dry, no more smell, and it's mixed with the desiccating agent. And peat moss is another common one that's used. So you just get yourself some peat moss and put some in. And they're said to work very well. The only issue with them is that they're set up to separate urine from solids. And the urine just goes into a jug, usually mounted somewhere on the front of the composting head. And every so often you have to dump the urine jug. Now, technically, anything that goes into a marine head is illegal to dispose of within 3 miles of land. So legally, you can't simply take your jug of urine and dump it over the side unless you're at least 3 miles out. And if you're in a marina, basically what's going to happen is you are going to be taking your jug of urine up and dumping it into one of the marina toilets periodically. And in my experience, if you drink a lot of water, two people are probably going to be putting the better part of a gallon of urine into that jug daily. and you're going to fairly quickly run out of volume, maybe 2 days at the most. So you're going to have to dump that frequently, and that's an issue. The other issue is, as you use a composting toilet, the container at the bottom of it is going to gradually fill up with waste. And people I know that have them say they get 3 to 4 weeks of full-time use for 2 people. And then you have to dump the contents somewhere. Now the thing about it is, although it's called a composting head, the contents are not really composted. They're simply dried out. And you're going to have to take that and dispose of it someplace. Now, a lot of people simply put it in a plastic bag and throw it in a dumpster. Personally, I find the idea of throwing dried human waste in a dumpster a little bit not quite right, but that's what you're going to end up doing. You don't really have much choice with the composting head. The advantage is no holding tank. You can probably go 3 weeks to a month for 2 people without having to worry about it. And they are said not to smell, as long as the ventilating fan attached to them doesn't fail. Hey, there's one other option for a marine head on an old fiberglass sailboat, and that is a porta potty or cassette toilet. Basically a portable toilet. You can just take, if your head breaks, you can just take it out and put a porta potty in. All you have to do is lash it down somehow and you're in business. Porta potties work fine. The disadvantage to them is their waste reservoir is either somewhere in a 2.5 to 6 gallon range. And then you have to take the waste reservoir out of the boat, carry it up to a toilet someplace, and dump it in. And if it's a 6 gallon one, that means you're going to be lugging the better part of 50 pounds of liquefied poop up to the toilet. And you don't want to slip and drop it. Believe me, that can create an unpleasant situation. So those are the options for the actual head. Now, unless you have a composting toilet or a porta potty, you are going to have a marine sanitation device or holding tank. Now, holding tanks come in several varieties. I think by far the best option for a holding tank is a polyethylene or plastic one, like you saw in Sequester's head. They come in all sorts of different sizes. We happen to have a 13-gallon tank, which for the 2 of us is good for about a week. And then we have to find some place to pump out. So smaller tank, more frequent pump outs. Bigger tank, less frequent pump outs, but you have a big tank of poop somewhere in the boat. Now I have space underneath my V-berth to put a pretty good sized holding tank in, but my wife vetoed the idea of a tank full of poop under the bed. I don't know why, but she just was 100% opposed to it. So that's why I have a tank in a locker outboard of the actual head, and why the tank is relatively small. But a polyethylene holding tank won't corrode and won't be affected by the contents, and is very good in terms of odor permeation. They last a long time and they're relatively inexpensive. Also, there are companies that will make a custom polyethylene holding tank for you to fit an available space. You send them a drawing of the space and they'll build a tank using what's called rotomolding. So that gives you a seamless tank with that will fit right where you want it to fit and occupy the maximum amount of space there, so you can get the biggest possible tank in the available space. Now those are a little more expensive, but that's a good option. Another kind of holding tank that's used occasionally is what's called a bladder tank. Now bladder tanks typically are in the 20 to 30 gallon capacity range, and they They're basically a nylon bag that's lined with some sort of rubber or plastic or urethane, and as you use them they fill up, and then when you pump them out they empty out, and they work quite well. They're easy to install. You just need a good solid surface to put them on, so that they don't have any protrusions sticking into the tank that could damage it. And they work pretty well, and I know people that have them who quite like them. So that is an option. If the boat you're looking at has one, don't run away from it. They work quite well. And the third option is a fiberglass tank. Now you will find on some boats that you will find a homemade fiberglass tank. There's nothing wrong with that. It's easy to do, and some of them are just a plywood tank lined with fiberglass. That's less desirable than an all fiberglass tank, because the plywood, if it gets wet, can rot, and then you won't have adequate support for the glass lining. But fiberglass tanks are good. They don't corrode, and they're not affected by the contents. Now, there are also metal tanks that some people have. I wouldn't use an aluminum tank. Aluminum is easily corroded by acids, such as you will find in urine, and I think a poor choice, although you will occasionally find someone who's got an aluminum holding tank. And the other option is either steel or stainless steel. And those will both work, but on an older boat, if it had a steel holding tank, I would want to inspect it very carefully for corrosion, because the last thing you want is to have the tank rust through from the inside and the contents leak out into the boat, because it could be very difficult to completely clean it out and get rid of the accompanying odor. Stainless tanks are also susceptible to corrosion, particularly on the welds. If you have acid in the contents, so I would also consider a stainless tank not the ideal source. My preference, as I said, is a polyethylene tank, and they're pretty easily available. And one of the things I would do if I was buying an old fiberglass sailboat and it had a metal tank, stainless steel or steel, is I would probably look at replacing it relatively quickly with a polyethylene tank. Okay, so that's tankage. The next thing is pump out. How do you get the waste out of the tank? Now you may have noticed that in my holding tank, all the penetrations or openings in the tank are at the top, and that's by design. I do not want an opening at the bottom, for example, the pump out fitting, which could then gravity drain into a through hull. But if that fitting fails, or hose clamp holding a hose onto the fitting fails, then you have a gravity draining tank that goes into the bilge, and you definitely don't want that to happen. A tank with all the penetrations at the top cannot gravity drain. Now, what are the penetrations? Basically, you have three. You have a port, usually an 1.5-inch hose barb for waste to go in. Another port, usually an 1.5-inch hose barb, or if you have an electric macerator pump, it may only be a 1-inch hose barb, for that you can get waste out with. Like in my case, there's a tube that goes from that hose barb on top of the tank down to the bottom of the tank, and it pumps from the bottom of the tank. And the other sort of discharge is a fitting at the bottom of the tank that the discharge hose connects to. And finally, there's a vent. The vent is usually going to be at least a 3/4-inch hose connected to a hose barb on top of the tank, and that vent hose needs to go outside the boat, preferably well above the water line. And on a lot of sailboats, that's going to mean it's going to have to come out not in the side of the hull, but somewhere on deck. And it's just a vent so that gases can escape from the tank while you're putting something into it, and when you're pumping out, air can get in so that the tank won't collapse due to creating a vacuum. And you need to take a look at where that vent hose goes and make sure that it isn't plugged, because if it's plugged, you're going to have problems. A plugged vent can make it essentially impossible to pump your tank out at a pump out, or to drain it even very effectively. And when you try to flush the head, a clogged vent is going to result in the head getting pressurized, and you may find you can't flush. So a vent is important, and you need a big one to allow enough air exchange in and out of the holding tank. And the final thing is the hoses that go from the tank to the head itself, and to your deck discharge for pump out, or if you are set up to go over the side, to a seacock to pump over the side. Now the thing is, there are lots of different kinds of hoses. Mostly for these you're going to be looking at 1.5 inch hoses for the inlet and outlet, and a 3/4 inch hose for the vent. Now one thing you want to make sure of with these hoses is that they are rated for use in a head. And the thing is, they need to be head rated, because say just regular rubber hose tends to become saturated with odor and becomes what's called odor permeable after only a year or two. And odor permeable means that the odors from inside the head are coming out of the surface of the hose. And that can give your boat that sort of characteristic head odor, which you don't want. And if you come onto a boat that's been closed up for a while, that you're looking at to buy, and the first thing you smell is a sort of stagnant head odor, that probably means that the hoses have odor permeated and need to be replaced. The other thing, of course, it could mean is that there was a leak and sewage is in the bilge. You want to hope that it's just the hoses. The thing though with those hoses is, depending on the type you buy, they can cost up to $20 a foot. So my boat has about 15 feet of hose, so replacing it with high-end non-odor permeable hose is probably good for 15 years or so. Is going to cost at least $300 today in 2022. And you want non-odor permeable hose rated for use in sanitation systems for all the hose connections to your head. And the final hose connection is from a water source to provide water for flushing your head. There are two options. You can plumb it to a seacock, or often people will have it plumbed to the drain in the sink in the head, and it will, but below the water line, and it will draw in seawater to flush the head. Now that works fine, although seawater has a lot of life in it, and if you're not using the boat all the time and putting fresh seawater into the head to flush, and you leave a little sitting in there, what's alive in there will die, and you will have an odor. The way around that is to use a freshwater flush. And in that case, we use water out of our boat water tank. And ours is plumbed, the intake for the head water is plumbed to the drain of the sink. But what we do is close the seacock and just run a little water into the sink and then pump it through the head. That has a couple of benefits. One, it decreases odor dramatically, which will happen if you don't use the boat on a more or less daily basis. And it also allows you to monitor how much water you're using for flushing. If you're just pumping the water out of in from a seacock, you may put quite a lot of water into the head on each flush. And if you put a lot of water in, you're going to fill up your holding tank more quickly and have to pump out more often. Now, if you are using a freshwater flush, or you maybe pour a cup of water into the head sink and then pump that through, you know that you only put a cup of water in. And you can limit how much water you're putting in to what's needed and get more time out of your holding tank. And the other final thing is, if you have your head water input plumbed to your water system, you have to trust that the valves in there don't allow the contents of the head ever to go back through the hose and into the water system. And plumbing it to the drain on the sink eliminates that problem because there's no direct connection to your freshwater system. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about marine heads. I hope you found this useful, hopefully interesting too, and because it is something you need to know with an old fiberglass sailboat. So if you like this, please give me a thumbs up, and to get notifications when more of my exciting content is posted, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel and going hog wild and clicking that notification bell. Thanks for watching.